Welcome back. In the previous video, we finished implementing our interpolation for the camera zoom. So when we're aiming, we're zooming in and out, and it's a nice smooth transition. But you'll notice that the character just stands there and doesn't do anything. We would like her to look like she's aiming by lifting the weapon up a little bit. So we're going to do that in this video. So let's get started. Okay, I'm going to open up the shooter animation blueprint. Now let's go to the anim graph, which is way back out here. And down here, when we have our blend between ground locomotion and weapon fire, which is really just the ground locomotion running through the weapon fire slot, we're feeding all this into the output pose. But we're going to want to cache this off so that we can use it to perform another blend. So I'm going to hold Alt and click to disconnect the pin to the output pose, and I'm going to cache off this result from layered blend per bone. So I'm going to drag off of this and type CACHE for cache, and I'm going to say new save cached pose. I'm going to click on it to rename it, and I'm going to call this cached ground loco with fire. Ground loco with fire. That sounds pretty epic. It sounds kind of crazy, but that's what we're going to call it because it's ground locomotion running through the fire slot and blended. So now that we have that, we need to know what we're going to use for our aiming animation so that we can do some more blending. Well, let's take a look at our asset browser. And if you've poked around in the animations that come with Bellica, you may have stumbled across an animation that's called RMB underscore AO underscore CC. And if you double click that, you'll see that it's just standing still, but take a look at what she's doing. She's aiming. This is beautiful. This is exactly what I was looking for. I wanted something that looked like she was aiming. So if we could transition from the hip fire position to the aiming position, that would be perfect. So this is the animation we want to use. Now you'll notice in this animation asset in the editor, in additive settings, this has the additive anim type mesh space. Now we don't want an additive animation. It's okay if you don't know what additive animations are yet. Just know that for our purposes, we don't need that. Now instead of changing the original here, we're going to copy this into our animations folder like we've been doing when we're changing other animations. So let's go into our Paragon Lieutenant Bellica, Characters, Heroes, Bellica, Animations, and look for RMB AOCC. And we'll open our Character Animations folder, and we'll drag this into our Animations folder and click Copy Here, and X out of that filter. Now we can go to our Animations folder and rename this, and that's kind of an obscure name that doesn't really mean much to us right now. We can rename this Aiming Pose. So we have our Aiming Pose, and let's open this, and for Additive Anim Type, we'll select No Additive, so it's not an additive animation. Now let's go back to Shooter Anim BP. Now what I'd like to do is create a state machine that is simply her standing in this aiming state. So let's right click and type state machine and add new state machine. And I'm going to call this new state machine aiming upper body. And inside the state machine, all I want to do is use our aiming pose. So I'm going to find aiming pose in the asset browser. And instead of dragging off and adding a state, what I can do is drag in aiming pose straight in here. And it'll automatically create a state for me which contains the aiming pose. If you double click, there it is. So that's a shortcut, is just dragging an animation in, and it'll create a state for us. Now I'm going to drag off from the entry to the aiming pose, and that's all this state machine does, is it goes straight into the aiming pose. So back out in the anim graph, we have our aiming upper body state machine, and I'm going to cache this off. So drag off, cache, new saved cached pose, and I'm going to call this cached aiming upper body. So now we can use that whenever we need it. So I can add a comment to this and say idle with aiming upper body. Now what I'd like to do is blend between our cached ground loco with fire and our aiming upper body. So just below here, I'm going to use the cached pose ground loco with fire. Make sure you get the right one, ground loco with fire. And then I'm going to use cached aiming upper body. And I'm going to blend between these two using a layered blend per bone, just like we did before. So layered blend per bone, and the base pose will be cached ground loco with fire, and the blend pose will be cached aiming upper body. And the result will be dragged in to the output pose. Now, clicking on layered blend per bone, we need to configure this. So in config and layer setup, we have this branch filters. We're going to add an array element to that. And for the bone name, we're going to use spine01 just like we did before. So let's take a look at how this looks in the editor. And it looks like she's aiming. But if you fire, notice she isn't animating. We're not getting that recoil anymore. And that's because we're taking over the top half of the body, and that animation is being overwritten. So we can still get some of that recoil animation if we change the blend weights a little bit. Let's make this, instead of 1.0, something lower like 0.75. Let's give that a try. And now we see that we're still getting some of that recoil on the shoulder. And that looks pretty good. It doesn't have to be very dramatic. It can be pretty subtle. So that's cool. So we're blending, but we're also getting some of that recoil animation from our weapon fire slot. So now we've taken care of getting our character to look like she's aiming, but we need to switch between these two based on whether or not we're aiming. We don't want to be in the aiming pose all the time. So we'll take care of that in the next video with an aiming state machine. We'll see you in the next video.